She's going back row.
We were trying to decide, should we sit?
Oh.
I said second. I was too busy.
Yeah.
I every class I did.
Oh, me too. Actually, with.
Yeah.
Over there, depending on what the door was.
Except US's grads and the teacher will walk in, has me question every freaking day, so I try to hide.
You're hiding your, you know.
12 years later, I got.
Did you want
And I
it?
ran into him and I was like, hey, so.
That's good.
At least just kind of getting to know other people.
That
Nice
is
thing
it.
about it. But people will be talking about really briefly. Yeah.
And I'm just. Needs to do so. I think so. So nice. Make sure you're faithful.
Oh, you just kind of go through it, yeah. It's nice.
Yeah.
That's a lot.
Yeah, it's the right one, and then we can like center. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Cost to that, you know that.
You're fine. Doing it. Your husband doing?
That's neat. Yeah. Wait, isn't there an easy way to do this?
He didn't say anything?
No.
Why it happened to me? Wow.
Then one more, there's 2 more tests that are.
Usually they send the links, but I.
Things.
That's scary.
It's a good thing your son wasn't up at that time, because that.
So good morning, everybody. Thanks for being here this morning. My name is Stephanie Foster, and I am the director of our Disabled Student Programs and Services Office. And with me is Katrina.
Hey everyone, I'm Katrina Marquez McClellan. I am the program manager for Disabled Student Programs and Services and the testing center. Currently, so when we get to that accommodated testing portion of our presentation, you're welcome to reach out to me with any questions, and Stephanie as well.
So thanks again for joining. I know this topic, I know school hasn't started, not everybody's here, and hopefully we can continue to do some stuff maybe throughout the semester for folks. I know DSPS is a topic that a lot of people seem to have questions about. We work in a very gray area field with disability law, and accommodations can be really challenging sometimes and confusing. And so I totally get that. Sometimes it's hard and challenging for us too. But hopefully throughout the course of the semester and throughout the years that you all are working here, the intention is for us to work really collaboratively, especially when there's questions or confusion or challenging situations, those gray areas that we have to work through. It's really important that we work together to establish what works. So I'm really glad that you guys are here today. What we're going to be focusing on today is just kind of a general overview of DSPS, disability services, what accommodations look like, et cetera. And then we're going to focus on what we're calling our faculty portal, which is basically just our new way of sort of being able to manage accommodations between student, our office, and you all. And so it's really important that you guys feel comfortable with how to manage that. If you haven't already, we piloted it last semester, but we're going to continue to be using that. And hopefully it does. If you've been here before and have used accommodations with students in the past, hopefully you find this process a little bit easier actually than it used to be, or at least a little bit more streamlined. So that's what we'll be spending our time on today. And we will, of course, also have room for any type of questions at the end related to our office. So again, with Disabled Student Programs and Services, if you're not familiar with our office, you'll hear us most often referred to as DSPS. And what we do is that we work with students on campus with disabilities in making sure that they have access, equitable access to participate in their courses here on campus. And so we do have to follow disability law, specifically regarding the ADA and the Rehabilitation Act. And that is where our office comes in again in making sure that the campus is compliant, that you all are compliant, that we're serving the students equitably, but that we're also doing it reasonably, within reason. The intention is not to give students an advantage or a step up in any way, but actually to level the playing field so that students with disabilities are not negatively impacted because they have a disability and are still able to participate in their courses. And so for students to be eligible for our services, seems obvious, but of course, will qualify for services if they've had an IEP or 504 plan like in high school. What that means is that they already were identified as a person with a disability that required accommodations. And so typically that means that they will qualify at our institution as well. There are some differences, however, between the accommodations that they may have received in high school in comparison to a post-secondary institution. And so it's really important that students that were using accommodations in high school come to our office, establish those accommodations with us, or talk about what the differences are if there were accommodations they were receiving that do not apply the same way at our institution. Students with any type of physical or mobility impairment would qualify for services. Students who are deaf or hard of hearing. There's an array of invisible disabilities that could qualify students for disability services. One thing that students, faculty, and a lot of people don't realize is that temporary disabilities qualify as well. So that can be anything from temporary medical conditions or illness, things related to cancer, for example. Students receiving like ongoing chemotherapy, for example, are going to have a significant impact, right, on their health and potentially their participation in courses. So we would want to look at that and any accommodations that might be able to support them. Students who've had surgery, students who broke their arm and are now having challenges keeping up with note taking, for example. That just means that they're feeling an impact of their disability currently, but it's not necessarily going to be forever, right? There's going to be probably an identified end date or a hypothesized end date of that impact, but they would qualify for services while they are being impacted. And so it's important that students realize that as well. Or maybe they've never been diagnosed with a disability before, but recently were. And so even if they've never received services in the past, of course, they would still qualify for services with our office. This, of course, is not an exhaustive list here, but also at the end of the day, what we're identifying is not just that they have a disability, but that they also are experiencing an academic related barrier because of that disability. So it's also completely possible. For example, an obvious one, maybe a student that's in a wheelchair. Sure, they're in a wheelchair, but if they're able to access all their courses, they're able to access seating in class with their wheelchair. They may have no other barriers in your class, right? And so they may not need any type of academic accommodation. And so we want to look at that too, that just because you have a disability doesn't necessarily mean you need academic accommodations. But if you do, you need to come to our office. And if you're not sure, they should still come to our office and talk to our office about what that would look like for them on our campus. So what is an accommodation when we talk about that? So essentially an accommodation would be some sort of modification or change in the instructional setting that would ensure that students have equal access. And so again, the intention is not to being recorded. Ability is actually creating a disadvantage, and we want to make sure that we're able to then identify what they need to do to be able to perform at the level of their peers, or at least access the information at the same level of their peers so that they can demonstrate their knowledge. Because sometimes their disability and then the barriers that are created are not giving the student the opportunity to actually demonstrate what they know. And so we want to make sure that they're able to do that regardless of their disability. So some quick examples here that you might commonly see are things like extended time on exams or quizzes. That's where our testing center comes in, and we'll get into that a bit later here. Students may need just a distraction-reduced environment. They may need access to some sort of assistive technology. A good example I like to use when we talk about leveling the playing field, again, is maybe a more obvious one, but a student in your class who is blind or has some sort of visual impairment, and in your class you give out physical handouts or you're using a textbook on printed material, right? It's pretty obvious in this example that a student that is blind or has a visual impairment is not course not going to be able to demonstrate their knowledge or understanding of the course material because they can't even access it, right? And so that's where our office would come in to make sure that they do have access to that material so that they can read it instead, using assistive technology on a computer to get access to that material so then they can participate in your class and demonstrate what they know. So that's an obvious example, but that's what we're doing with all of our students. We're, again, leveling that playing field and making sure that they have access the same as their peers do. Before we move on, are there any questions just about our office in general, services we provide, accommodations? One thing that you guys may play a big factor in is getting students to apply for our services. The students you are often their first point of contact, right? Or maybe they're only when they come to campus, they're seeing you. They don't have to come see us. Sometimes students don't even know that they have to come see us if they want accommodations. Something that happens quite frequently, especially students coming straight from high school, is that if they may have had accommodations in the past, but they don't realize that they have to establish them here. It's very common for high school students to come to our institution and think that their accommodations just apply like they did in high school. For some context, in high school, if a student has an IEP or 504 plan, that's established by the school and it's communicated by the school to anybody that student's going to take courses with, and that happens automatically. That's not how it works in college. you have to self-identify. So you have to come to our office and establish accommodations. You also then have to take an additional step to also specifically request those accommodations for your courses. It does not happen automatically. And that's because they do need to establish what they want, who we're allowed to communicate that information with. So just because they come to our office is also not the only step. We still basically need permission that we can communicate that information to you if they want us to. So students, especially again from high school, aren't aware a lot of times of those processes. And so if a student does approach you saying that they had an IEP or a 504 plan in high school, or sometimes it happens where they try to even physically give you their IEP or 504 plan from high school, that's a great opportunity for you to let them know that they have to come to our office and use that IEP or 504 plan to establish services with us. And that they have to do that for you to basically have to abide by any type of accommodation. That applies to dual enrollment students as well, for anybody that might have dual enrollment here. Which again is a confusing situation for most students in high school because they may have an active IEP and 504 plan, and again assume if they're in a BC class, a dual enrollment course, that it just automatically applies, and it does not. We are a separate institution and a post-secondary institution, and our laws are different than high school. So even if they have an active IEP, they have to establish services with us for those accommodations to apply to a dual enrollment class. And as much as we try to preach that in the high schools, that information gets lost a lot of the time, and students often don't realize that they have to do that. So again, that's where faculty is really important, because as long as you know that, you can support the student properly to guide them appropriately to our office. Yes.
Question on that. So if we had a dual enrollment class, and then say like it's in my class, right, at like Southwest, and they need like special accommodations for testing, where would they test at?
So we do set testing services at the Southwest campus, but we would then have to look at an alternate time for them to take that exam, either earlier before the start of class, or whatever. We would coordinate that with the instructor, but we do it on site as well. We have staff that go to the Southwest and all of our campuses to proctor exams.
Okay.
And so we are using, again, a new system. If you've used or have had students in the past that you've had that use accommodations, you're probably used to our old processes, which essentially was a student coming into your class and handing you a letter that detailed the accommodations that they were using. That is not how that will happen anymore. We are using what's called Clockwork, but we refer to it as our student portal or our faculty portal. And pretty much everything now that we do to coordinate our services can happen on this portal. So it's hopefully going to be really helpful in streamlining information, establishing services quickly, getting information to you quickly, and it's all coming from one place. And so students will access their version of the portal. And on that portal, they can apply for our services, upload their documentation which we need to show that they have a disability. And then once they do that, they meet with one of our counselors in our office to establish what an accommodation plan would look like. And then after that is where you all would come into that process. And so within the faculty portal is where you'll be able to access all of the information related to any students in your class that have accommodations, and then anything thereafter, scheduling exams, etc., which we'll go into detail. So this is what it'll look like. You can access this on our website. On our main homepage, there is an access button for students and for faculty. It takes you to the same place though. And again, students can come in here to directly fill out their application. So again, if you do have a student that you're directing to apply for services, you can direct them right to our website. And there is a button for them to apply, and it'll take them here to submit their application. Then they can also submit their documentation. And so these are all going to be things basically for students to be able to manage what they need with our office. And yours will be over here, which will take you specifically to your faculty portal.
If someone wants to apply or see, and maybe they have never been diagnosed and they just feel like something's wrong, should they do this first or should they visit the office?
They should visit our office. They can apply, but they should come and probably have a conversation with someone in our office because sometimes we are able, especially if they don't have any type of documentation, we can sometimes have a conversation with them to maybe even better explore. Sometimes there's more to it than they think. I've seen students in the past who they were certain they had a learning disability but didn't have evidence of it. And so they didn't apply because they thought they didn't qualify for services. After a conversation with that student, I found out that they were a disabled veteran. They were considered 100% disabled through the VA, which would qualify for them for services and would allow us to have more conversations with them about the challenges they're having with learning. And so you should please encourage them in person, come or call, whatever, to have that conversation for sure. Because we won't be able to set a meeting with a counselor to establish accommodations without some type of documentation. So they can complete an application, but if they don't have documentation to support it, we can't establish that intake appointment. So they'd probably have to come and speak with someone in our office
And then
anyway.
you let them know how to get some documentation, where to go, and okay.
Does this website or does Banner show you when students enroll? Does it have like something next to their name, like if they have a certain disability? PD?
So on your faculty portal, if there's any students that have registered with our office and are using accommodations and are registered in your class, their names will appear in that class if they've requested accommodations. Through your faculty portal, yeah. And it'll show an example, I think, here in a little bit. But there will be no information about their disability. Only that they basically have registered with our office, so they've been verified as having a disability. But the only information that is shared is what accommodations they've requested for your class.
Okay. And who has access to the faculty portal?
All faculty.
Have access?
No, it'll be whoever's identified. It all communicates with Banner. Is how it syncs the information. So whatever instructor is basically paired with like that CRN within the catalog or within Banner, that's the person who will then have access.
So student employees should not have access.
Okay. So when it comes to accommodation letters, as I mentioned before, if you had students in the past, they had a letter that they delivered in person and it detailed their accommodations. It is the same information being communicated, but it does look different and the process will happen differently than in the past. You will get a direct email notification from DSPS if a student has requested accommodations in your class. And so please make sure that you are checking your emails for anything from the DSPS desk, because that is where the accommodation information will be emailed to you directly. I like to mention to faculty as well that not reading this letter legally is not going to be an excuse to not give accommodations. And so that happens a lot where faculty will say, oh no, like I just didn't see it. So it's not like they were doing it out of malice. But legally, if a student then filed any type of grievance or complaint that their rights were violated, saying I didn't read it is not going to hold up. It's going to be considered a civil rights violation. So please make sure you're checking your emails. However, anything that is, again, requested for any of your classes will all show up in one area on your faculty portal as well. So you'll be sent an individual notice this way via email, but all that information is also condensed in one spot in your faculty portal. So you can find it there as well.
So I get a little bit uncomfortable, for example, when I read it. Suppose it says sit in front seat, right? I don't want to, say, oh, this is your seat, so and so.
Sure.
You wait, and I mean, I just figure like I let them tell me, like, yes, I have a list of what you get, but I'm not gonna.
And that's perfectly all right, especially with the example that you just used. The student obviously has every right to go and sit in the front. They also don't have to if they choose not to. If though the student is experiencing challenges, what I like to communicate with students is if they really feel they need that and they're not getting it because everybody's filling it up. Well, one, we'll recommend of course, get to class early so that you can get that seat. But if it continues to actually be a challenge, my encouragement to the student would be have a discussion with your faculty member. Because then if there is opportunity to discreetly save a seat for a student because they are continuing to have challenges, maybe they have class right before yours and they get there right on time and it's filled up every time and it's really impacting whatever it is that they're, experiencing. Then maybe it'd be possible to, put a folder on the desk or a jacket or something, kind of, discreetly reserve that seat for the student. But that should probably needs to be communicated by the student, of course, if they're having a challenge with that. You would have no way of knowing that. And if they're not sitting in the front, that also could be their by choice. Yeah.
So that's why when you said you need to make sure you read it and accommodate and we're responsible for that, which of course, but then I don't do anything until the student says, oh, I want, and then I'm like, oh, yeah.
Yes, and there's plenty of accommodations, and we'll kind of get into that here in a little bit too, like testing, that even when it's on the letter, there is still additional things the student has to do to request that be used when they want. Because again, they might have testing accommodations, but decide on my next exam, I actually don't think I need to use my accommodations. And they have the prerogative to make that decision. But if they do want to use it, there are things they have to do to say, I want to use it for this exam on this day. And if they don't do that, you're under no obligation to seek them out. But what we also do encourage to students and to faculty is that have conversations. We encourage students that even when you're sharing this letter, they don't have to, but what we recommend is still approach your faculty member after class, office hours, whatever, and have a conversation just to make sure you're on the same page, and to make sure that you both are in understanding of how the accommodations apply to your class and kind of what you're going to, do together, and to have those conversations throughout the semester, because that's when things go the smoothest, is when we're unfortunately, we find out about things after the fact, but then we also find out that the student never brought it up to their faculty, they never brought it up to us. And so because we can help with that facilitation as well. If a student feels uncomfortable, or feels, oh, my faculty member is really mean to me, whatever it is, or they're telling me they're not going to let me do this, oftentimes that's a misunderstanding. But we can even help facilitate that just to make sure everyone's feeling comfortable and on the same page, and that these accommodations are happening the way that they should. But we do need that communication. Also, conversely, if you're having challenges or concerns with a student and the way that the accommodations are playing out or whatever, we also encourage you, please reach out to us so that we can hear what your challenges are. If we need to involve the student in that conversation, we can do that. Yes.
Would we be getting an email for each student that, okay?
Yes.
So not just like one email?
No, anytime a student requests accommodations in your course, you'll get an individual email. However, in your faculty portal, again, that information is.
So you all, I just asked because so last semester, I ended up having 2 students who were getting accommodations, but I could not find an email at all for one of them. And I didn't realize the portal was a thing yet. I did find an email for one student, but not for another one. And so if I had it, and because I didn't know the portal was being in use, I would have never known if I ended up having some minor issues later in the semester because of it. But yeah, the second email that the student said that they thought it went through, but I never had any.
Sure.
So
to be fair too, last semester was also the first semester we were using this system.
Okay.
And especially at the beginning of the semester, we were doing things a different way. It wasn't really working out kind of for which delivering them.
Okay.
Or emailing them, and then it just seemed better to make it.
Normally we should get an automated email from DSPS saying your student qualifies for, or that they have accommodations, and each individual student, so we could get 5 separate emails.
Yes.
Okay, good.
And if you don't, if a student does approach you and you've not gotten that letter, we'll show you what it looks like in the portal if they have requested it. So of course, go there first and see that if they show up there, and if they still don't, then you should encourage the student to check back with our office, or even you can reach out to a student, just say the student says they have this. I don't see it, so we can make sure that there's not some kind of issue on our end, or maybe they just really didn't request it. Or maybe they're not a student with our office at all. So this is an example of the old accommodation checklist and kind of what that looked like. So again, and then over here, is an example of what the letter will look like now. It's a little cleaner, same information though. So anything. Specifically will now just appear as a bullet point checklist there. What we are trying to work on though is trying to delineate some accommodations do technically apply to your class, but might not be something that you are personally responsible for. An example is assistive technology. A student probably more likely needs that for the exams they're taking in your class. And so you might be responsible for providing like an electronic copy of that exam, but mostly that's handled by the testing center. And so the testing center, and we'll get into when students request their exams, if a student needs an electronic version of an exam so that they can use assistive technology, that's communicated by a test request that the testing center will then give to you. There's not necessarily anything in class that you have to do about that. It indicates they have priority registration. That's something that all of our students get. Doesn't really involve you necessarily, but it technically is an accommodation that they're approved for. So we're trying to find a way to kind of delineate some of those things that it's like our responsibility, your responsibility. But if you look it over and there's one that you're like, I'm not really sure what that means or what I do for this. Of course, you can always reach out to our office and we'll clarify for you. You can go through and ask any questions about the checklist you need to ask so that we can make sure that you understand what's going on and what's expected of you.
You have a question on Zoom.
Oh, okay. See it.
I
Oh,
think it's me.
Yep.
So my question had to do with, I had a student who had accommodations. Oh, you can't?
I can. Hold on one second. For this.
I've unmuted myself. Can you hear me now?
Sorry, Fabiola, I can't hear you, so they're gonna try to see if
Huh.
it's
Okay, Melina says she can hear me. I'm trying not to be too loud. Somebody told me I was too loud yesterday.
I do that all the time.
Do you want me to put it in the chat?
There we go.
Well, I can hear you now through her.
Oh, okay. So I had a student who was having difficulty, had the DSPS paperwork that said she needed to sit in the front row. She's in the back, she's on her phone, talking with her friend the whole time and not doing well. So I pulled her aside and said, your DSPS says you should be sitting in the front, less distraction. And she refused.
Mm-hmm.
And the semester goes on and she's still not doing well. So I pulled her aside again and I said, I really think you need to sit in the front and away from your friend would be helpful. And she still refused. So I ultimately put a starfish notification to kind of cover that I was recognizing where her DSPS, she refused them. Is that the best way to handle that? Because she almost got belligerent and I almost had to ask her to leave. But it started to escalate is what I'm saying. So I put a starfish saying she's not doing what her accommodations say she should be doing.
Sure. No, and I think that is, did you guys hear what she said? I think that's a perfectly appropriate way to handle that. Even students with disabilities reserve the right to fail. Right? And so I think that communicating that information is great because then we also know that that's on our radar. If students come and check in with us, we can kind of talk to them about that too. And then other than that, if they're choosing not to use their accommodations, and then they reserve the right to suffer whatever repercussions come of that. So I think that you handled that appropriately.
Okay, I just didn't want it to come back and bite me that, well, she's sitting in the back row. And I'm like, yeah, and we talked about it.
Sure.
So
No, I think that's great how you handled that.
Thanks.
So the letter will be communicated with you. Any questions about that, let us know. So this is what the faculty portal will look like when you open it up. So There should be a link also when you get the student notification letters, there should be a link as well to your faculty portal, so you can access it that way. Or again, you can access it on the main homepage of the DSPS website. And it's a single sign-on, so it'll sign you in automatically if you're already signed on through your Bakersfield College credentials. So when you log in, you should be able to log in and then see all of your courses listed and any accommodation letters that have been requested for each course that you are teaching that semester. So any student that has requested accommodations will appear for each of those classes. If there's no students, that's an indication that no students either have a disciplinary class or have requested accommodations. But you should see that there, and you should be able then also to access the button on the right over there to view the letter individually.
How early before the semester starts can we see these?
As long as the student is established, it should be, if they're registered, you had something to say.
Yeah, because there are dates in the clockwork system that we identify that would still be like spring semester, certain semesters. So we have it set the week before the actual semester starts. They should be associated with that term.
And then that leads me also to an additional thought that students can request accommodations at any point during the semester. And so you tend to see an influx of them at the start of the semester, but students can register for and receive services at any point. There's no deadlines or anything like that as far as being qualified for services. And so it's quite possible it could be the middle of the semester that a student requests accommodations for the first time, or maybe even towards the end of the semester, a student requests accommodations for the first time, but it's communicated with you all the same.
You have another question.
Okay.
Yeah. Hi, Stephanie. I have a question. So last semester I didn't even use the portal. I don't know why. I didn't know about it, but I did have maybe 4 students that were DSPS and they gave me their forms, so I just honored it. But is that gonna, like, I feel like that might be a problem.
Yeah,
Like
so
if,
that shouldn't
yeah,
happen anymore moving forward. It's possible it happened last semester, but
okay.
now all that communication should be happening in the process that we're communicating today. So if they hand you a physical letter,
Yeah.
I would still verify through your portal
Okay.
that the student has requested accommodations, just to ensure that it's up to date and valid. Not old or altered in any way, I guess. It really should all be coming through email.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Through your the faculty portal.
I just wanted to add on a side note, if you turn off the microphone on that one, then there won't be that echo, so it's easier because the microphone is here in the room.
Oh, that's my next page. So when you're on your faculty portal and you're reviewing these accommodations, you also have the option here to acknowledge that you've received and reviewed the accommodation letter. That is just a really clean, nice way that communicates to the students and to us that you're like, cool, got it. As I mentioned before, though, even if you don't do that, like legally, it doesn't matter if you do this or not. We know if you received it because it'll show on our end too that you received it. But this is just a really nice way to be able to communicate that. And so we do encourage you to do that, to go in and acknowledge it, please. Any questions before we move on to testing, just about the faculty portal or kind of the accommodation letter process, anything like that? Yeah, so now we'll talk about accommodated testing.
So, yes, accommodated testing will be in the same faculty portal, and you'll see a screenshot here shortly where you'll be able to see your letters and your students who have submitted their accommodated testing requests. So if you've seen in the past, you may have, if you've been here a long time like me, you had a paper form that students brought to you. They filled out the top, you filled out the bottom, and then it was returned to the testing center. They were booked an appointment, and then you were notified like to turn in materials, right? The past few semesters, we've been using the form stack form where you got an email, you were asked to complete another form stack that gave all of the outlines for the exam of what their exam aids were, how you were gonna deliver the test, how you wanted the test back, all those special instructions. Now you can do all that within the instructor portal for one quiz, and it applies to all your students. So you don't have to keep filling out that instructor responsibility for each student that submits that request.
I don't know.
As mentioned, this is the main page. The students will go here to schedule an exam. That is where they will need to do that after they've given you the letter. And if you're in your instructor portal and you notice that they have an exam requested, but you don't have a letter, then please reach out to us, because they have the student reach out to us so we can assist them in generating that letter. So you'll see both on your section. Okay.
Yes, it's important that students understand, and you, that they have to request the accommodation before they can use it. Also, maybe a good time to mention for clarity purposes that accommodations are not retroactive. And so accommodations are considered active or at play the day they're requested. So sometimes a student may say, well, I needed additional time for the exam I took last week. It doesn't work like that, right? The accommodations will be put into place, not the day that we establish them, but the day they request them for your class, that day moving forward. So they could establish accommodations with us at the beginning of the semester, but if they don't request them for your class until mid-semester, that's the day that they are active. Does that make sense?
Just to clarify, so when they establish accommodations, is that when we would receive the email that says?
Not necessarily.
Okay, only if they request to
Correct.
use them.
They have to go in, just for context and big picture. When we establish them with accommodations and they have now access to their student portal, they have to go in and now specifically request the accommodations they want for the classes they want them for. Once they do that is when then you get that notification.
Oh, so I wonder if maybe the student I didn't get it for didn't actually.
Not have done it.
Okay.
We go over that with them in their intake appointment. We also offer support for that if they need help going through that. But sometimes students, whatever, they don't always. Good to go. They have to do this, and they have to do it every semester for every class that they want to use accommodations for.
And then so let's say they go in and then they do request the accommodations for your class, and we get the letter that says, what specific accommodations they get. If they don't schedule the exam, then what would you recommend as far as normally I would approach the student and say, hey, I know you have accommodations, but I don't see a request for an exam, but
if they don't request it, you are not obligated.
Okay.
I do think it's good practice to check in.
Right.
Just to make sure that the student's not doing that by accident. Maybe it slipped their mind, they didn't realize, and it's just, again, good practice just to be like, hey, just wanted to make sure you weren't trying to use these accommodations for the exam next week. Also that way that we don't run into where the day before the student is like, oh shoot, I wanted to use my accommodations. Now we're in a time crunch, which makes it really hard for you and for us to coordinate that.
Time frame still the same? I think the old way was 3 days in advance.
Okay. Yeah, I'll kind of cover that in just a minute.
Yeah. So if they don't do it, you are not obligated to provide it. However, I think it's important to check in with the student, especially if, we utilize the testing center because we also realize that it oftentimes is hard or impossible for faculty to accommodate additional time in a quiet space in class. But if you're able to accommodate whatever it is that they're needing in a classroom situation appropriately, that's okay too. But of course, we utilize the testing center so that we can help with that, because oftentimes we realize that that is difficult in a live classroom environment.
I do just want to add to some of that information too, though. So as with the question about you know, if the student doesn't request the exam date, if it's an online course, once they've generated that letter and you see that they have an extended time, it is your obligation to go into Canvas and adjust their time. We do still recommend to students that they submit the exam request to just give you that reminder that they're using that accommodation. And then there is a section where I think the student submits it or the faculty submit it where it says online. The test is online. Even though it's coming to us, we can't adjust that time for you. You have to do it in Canvas, but it does just give you that reminder that the student is using their accommodation. So let me make sure it's all set up before the exam opens. Just so you know. So this is what the old form stack looked like. Most of you have probably seen it. You input the student information, your information. Next slide would be the course information, the specific time and day of the allotted test date, and then the last day the student may take the exam. This is really important information. So if you do get these notifications, I very highly encourage you to provide us this information so that we can support all the students in the testing center, because we do some days have 55 students going in and out of testing. So as long as we have all the information that we need to be able to coordinate that, it runs a little bit smoother for us and for the student, because they're already kind of going in with high anxiety. So if we can get all this information ahead of time, that's the best.
And just to throw out a note, sorry, Katrina, to interrupt, but if we don't have all this information, or when we'll get into before how you can provide us the exam, when it comes the time for the student to take the exam, if we don't have it, we are then going to encourage the student now to coordinate with you either to get the exam or an alternate day to take the exam, because they're still due their right to their additional time. Obviously, we can't give them additional time if we don't have the exam. And then, and it happens, it's an oversight, but then also just be prepared to basically now allow the student to take it at a different time because that didn't happen in the first place. So more than likely, if that did happen, what I like to do is encourage students go to class. Now talk to your instructor. If you're able to them at that point provide us the exam, great. But if not, again, just be prepared that they will then take it a different day.
And then of course, all the testing information. So I believe we did keep it online in the Clockwork system. So you should be able to choose that. And then all of the exam aid and test delivery information, just like the form stack. So if we go to the next slide. You'll get that email when the student does request their accommodated test. You'll get the email saying this student has requested it. This is the day, this is the time. From that email, you can go into your instructor portal and begin providing us all of that testing information that we previously had and we discussed. If you go, I think next slide shows us what it looks like in that testing portal. There's a confirm and edit button where you can give us all that information. But you can also respond to that. Like if it's outside of the parameters of your exam, you're welcome to respond to that email, because it will come from a comm desk. Just so the letters will come from DSPS, and any testing appointments will come from a comm desk email with those notifications. So you can go in here and edit. If it's approved, you go in there, edit, give us all the information. Or there's a way that you can go in and tell us about your upcoming test in that instructor portal before students even submit their testing appointment requests. So the system should allow them only to book within that testing time that you've inputted on your testing days. Now it is software. Sometimes there's a glitch. Sometimes the system or the students will still request outside of the times that you put, because they, with their extended time, if they may have a class after you, they can't complete that. So it'll run into their next class. So we do encourage the student to have that communication with you to let you know what day and time they're looking at. And that way it's approved before we even get into this area of doing all of that information.
So what might be really great, and you don't have to, But it might just be good practice at the beginning of the semester to go in ahead of time proactively. You can input all the information about all of your exams for the semester, all of your quizzes. And then that way there's already kind of that established little skeleton for the students when they're scheduling their exams. Which could really help the process, again, just maybe go a little bit smoother. If you don't do that, that's okay too, but also just know that it's possible for the students, and it happens actually quite a lot, that they'll pick random days and times to take the test, which you don't have to approve, but then you are going to be obligated to go in and deny it, or talk to the student about it or whatever, which may take a couple more steps, which is also still fine. But we also want to make sure if we don't hear from you that it's not a problem what the student requested, then we're just going to assume that that was already pre-established and good to go. So you would have to jump in and insert and say, hold on, our class is on Thursday at 1, not on, Friday at 12. I want you to take it at class time. So you'd have to go in and do that. Or again, you can just do that all ahead of time and maybe mitigate some of that.
And then this is just kind of what it looks like. It's going to be that same information kind of on the form stack. You'll run through it all, give the information, give the test time and end time. Keep in mind that those are not with the extended time. What we are requesting from you is what the class is allotted. So if it's a 9 to 10 a.m. exam, that's what you put in. And then from there, we will go in and adjust the extended time in person in our center to make sure that they get that. Okay. And then there is this acknowledgement part, just like the accommodation letter. We do ask that you acknowledge that you've received it. Although again, as long as the email communication has been received, that is the student identifying that they are using that accommodation. And then next. Again, this is just running through this is what it looks like in the portal, but it's the same information that was on that previous form stack. So we can go to the next one. There is a way now that instead of emailing your exams to the Accom desk email, you can upload it right into the Clockworks portal. So when you're filling out all this information, if you already have your test to go, you can just upload it. From there, we can print it at the testing center at the time of the student's appointment and provide that information. Or if you don't have it, you can email it to us at a later time or still bring it in person. That's still an option there. And then how we'll return it to you. So back campus mail, electronically, we scan it over to you. Your same still preferred methods we can use. That is just showing where you upload your file, and then once you hit submit changes, it just gives you your confirmation that it's complete, and then you can go back to any other course that you may have that needs to do that. I do want to add real quick. Was there a question? I'm sorry.
Yeah,
Yes.
sorry. On the special instructions, last semester I had students, like two students for the same class, but one student got a cheat sheet or whatever, and the other did not. So I didn't know where to put that, but in the special instructions, I just said such and so gets blank and such and so does not get
That would
blank.
be exactly where you would do it.
Okay.
Yeah, in the special instructions, anything that's a cheat sheet, a 3x5 card, a specific calculator, a scientific calculator, because generally when calculators are given, they're just a basic calculator. So anything outside of that. Although we don't provide scientific calculators, so the students will have to bring that, but it does know that for math, then those are allowed.
Do you check them when they come in? Like, do you make them take their, check the cover and everything?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And then the students also turn in all of their devices, smartwatches, phones, and then they're kept outside of the testing location, so they don't have any of that while they're testing as well.
There's also in-person proctors as well as all of our testing areas have live
cameras. Yeah. I do want to add though, while we are moving away from the form stack procedure, it's not going to fully go away yet. So as Stephanie has mentioned, when students come in and we establish their accommodations, that can be any time within the semester. But then they take effect as soon as they have requested those. So we get new students throughout the whole semester. So if a student is new to our office, and has, established accommodations today, but then have an exam tomorrow, the clockwork system will not allow the student to submit their request. This clockwork system does use the 3 business day rule. So if that is established, you will get their accommodation letter. That will be the day that they establish. We generally, if we know they have a test coming up, we have them establish in the office before they even leave our office. We have them submit their request, and then go in and do the form stack. So you'll still maybe see those, but it will not be as much as you have seen in the past. Okay. And then if it's a student, they had an exam the first day, they did their request in Clockworks, everything went smoothly, and then you see a form stack from them, it means that they did not schedule within the 3 business days for the system. So at that point, it is a communication that the student should have with you, because you would have less time to get the exam to us, get us all that exam aids. So we do encourage you to still support the student with that exam, but it is not a guarantee that we can get those. And it may, in that gray area that Stephanie said, talk to us about, come and talk to us, because it may be that the student has to take it in class because they didn't meet that 3 days. Okay.
And that is going, because as we mentioned, we love our gray areas. I actually don't, but we have to live there. So we just have to embrace it. We do have to look at those things on a case-by-case basis. And so if a student is requesting, an accommodation for today, it's going to be probably pretty hard for us to be able to communicate that with you in time. If a student requested it yesterday and you do already have the exam ready to go, if we can get that established, that would be great. Of course, because we do have legal obligations to meet accommodations, whether or not they're kind of like inconvenient, but within reason. And so if it's like, there may be a case where a student's requesting they have a laboratory class, which requires all this equipment and things that we do not have time now to work out. We can consider that now sort of an unreasonable demand, and you have to go take that in class. But there also may be situations where we're like, well, we could work that out, and now we just kind of have to try our best to do that and honor that accommodation. And so that's just where our communication is going to be really important. It's always really important because this stuff is really challenging. But at the end of the day, I know we're all here to support our students the best that we can, but also know that on our end, we also know that we expect that to be done within reason. We hope not to be, asking you to do things that we believe are unreasonable. Sometimes also keep in mind though, sometimes they feel unreasonable, or we think that they are, but really it's, again, just more inconvenient than it is unreasonable. Or oftentimes it's frankly, a lot of times it's something that people just don't want to do because they're not used to doing it that way. And I do empathize with that as well, that sometimes we do have to think outside the box and it may be uncomfortable, but also is something we still have to do. So let's figure out how we're going to do it, right? So we ask for flexibility from you all, but also please believe always that we are on the same side. We just are really trying to protect our institution and you and our students and make sure that we're all doing what we need to do. So let's all be on the same team and do those things together, even when it kind of sucks a little bit, but we're all. Our contact information here. I mentioned before that if you do have questions, whether they're simple or complicated questions, we're available a number of different ways. So you can always call our office. Someone at our front desk may be able to answer your question. And if not, they can transfer to myself or Katrina if it's a more detailed question. You can always make an appointment as well if you think it's a little bit more complicated or deserves more discussion. We can always schedule time to sit and talk about specific instances that you're facing. We also have a virtual lobby, and that is open during the day, during business hours, where somebody is manning that. So that's also an option that you can pop in to ask somebody a question in our virtual lobby, or of course you can come into our office in person. But I do ask that if it is kind of a more detailed or complicated situation, that you reach out and let's schedule a time to talk about that so that we can really give it the attention that it needs. But you can do so a number of ways, either by contacting me directly or by calling our main office. If you want to schedule some time, you can do that too. Any questions?
I know you said that their IEPs and 504 plans are different from high school to college. So if we do have a dual enrollment course and they have to enroll through BC for those accommodation plans, how is that going to be different for those students?
So it really depends. Again, this is another great question. It completely depends on the accommodations they were already receiving. Most of the ones that you're gonna see that are gonna be different was because high school accommodations, their focus is on success. Their goal is for students to graduate and they're gonna make modifications based on that to get the students to the finish line. When you get to post-secondary, now we follow ADA laws and all of that. Our focus, of course, we want our students to succeed. But our focus when it comes to accommodations is on access, not on success. And so some of the common ones you might see that are different are huge alterations to things like assignments. A lot of IEPs will show that a student, has the opportunity to write their essay multiple times or take an exam multiple times until they get a certain score. That's not going to happen in a post-secondary institution. Something else might be even big modifications to exams, extensions on assignments, if they don't have to follow particular due dates and things like that sometimes. That's also likely not going to happen here because it just doesn't apply the same way. And so those are big ones, but there may be others. A lot of them also might be almost exactly the same. If they had note-taking accommodations, just extra time on exams, those are really common and those pretty much translate. But there are some big ones that will not occur or will look a lot different. And so that's why it's really important for us to make sure that students understand that so that they're not coming into your class expecting you to allow them to take their exam until they pass it. Of course, that's not going to happen here. So that's the main difference. Any other questions? Yes.
I have a few. Some of them are just like quickie one-offs, I think. One question was, so if we digitally send like an exam for a testing center situation, and we're like, oh, just scan it and send me that back. What happens to the file? What happens to the printed copy? I'm just curious about that.
The printed copy is stored until the end of the semester, and then everything is shredded.
Okay,
Yeah,
and
we keep it in case you say, oh, I never received it, then we.
right, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
And does the digital copy?
The digital copy stays in our an email box.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay. Just thinking about exam security.
Yeah.
Oh, and then another, hopefully, probably quick question. So would we say like extra testing time? Does that apply to what we might call like a quiz as well? Okay, I just never got like a good clear answer on that one.
Yeah, anything that is timed, in particular in class, or sometimes again, one of those gray things is, well, it's not really a test, it's a writing assignment, but it's timed. Like they have 30 minutes to do this writing assignment. That would actually apply as well. It's anything like that that is established within a time frame, not like a due date, like, oh, turn this in by the end of the day or turn this in tomorrow. That's not the same. As being physical.
Oh, so just like a due date doesn't necessarily mean, but if it's like a time limited contained activity, got it, okay. This is a question sometimes students ask me and I'm not usually sure. If a student doesn't already have documentation or it's been a long time, like does DSPS have the ability to assess the student for a disability, or do they have to refer it out, or do they like what's the options for students when they go in and they have no paperwork?
So my best answer to that again is it depends.
Okay.
My favorite answer. And that is perfectly acceptable. There are, however, a lot of others we of course would not be able to verify that way. We don't do any assessment or testing on our campus. And so what we would do with that student is have more of a detailed conversation about their history or what they've experienced, et cetera, to then identify where they might be able to go. Or if they did have maybe some history through a medical provider or a school or something, again, kind of talking to them about, well, here's how you then might be able to go get that. And so it completely depends, but having a conversation with us and to work through that would be the best bet.
Okay, and do you know if like the health center does anything like that at all?
We often work with our health center, in particular with students who are having like mental health challenges. If students are coming to us with any type of undiagnosed but disability there, but they're detailing a high amount of anxiety or depression, something like that, we will then often refer them to our student health center for that free service. And then there is the opportunity, dependent upon the recommendation of the therapist or whoever they see over there, if they want to attest to the student having anxiety or whatever, then we can take that into consideration either temporarily or permanently, again, kind of depending upon the situation. But sometimes also just treatment is helpful, especially with anxiety or depression. It may be a temporary situational thing that maybe going and talking to somebody took care of it. If they think it's going to require more than that, then they can write a letter for the student on their behalf as their documentation.
Okay, okay. No, that's good. That's helpful. And then last real quick one, hopefully real quick, what counts as a distraction reduced testing? Obviously like the testing center, but like in some cases I've offered to have the student come to my office and do the exam there if they're comfortable with it, or I try to give options, but as far as like what is actually allowed, that's what I'm not totally sure on. I've had a couple of times where a student doesn't necessarily want to go through the testing center, but they don't, like they'll come to my office and take the first 30 minutes of the test there, and then we walk over to class together, and then they finish it in class. Like that's what I'm like, ugh.
Sure. No, if that's something that the student feels is appropriate, that's something that they want to do, in particular, if they didn't want to take it at the testing center, and you have a space for them to do that, I think that is fine. If you are giving them a distraction reduced environment with additional time, so that's great. What we want to just ensure also where it can be tricky is that the student's not just saying, oh yeah, it's great. Do that.
Yeah.
And so we want to be able to work that out. So just having those open conversations with the student, I think is also appropriate, and then encouraging them to utilize the service that is intended. But if you're accommodating them, I think that's fine. And if you're not sure, you can always reach out to us too. And if we need to facilitate a conversation with the student as well, we can always do that.
I think, yeah, definitely would do that if I was really unsure, but just as far as like, is it okay for them to just come to my office and do it if they agree? Or is that like, nope, gotta do it through the testing center kind of thing? Or
I think that could be a suitable alternative if it works for the student.
okay.
Any other questions online? Great. Well, thank you guys so much for joining today, and I appreciate all the questions too. Good questions today.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm gonna stick around for a bit.
Bye, everybody online. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.